Several months ago, Bernie Sanders had an interview with the New York Times to discuss the support for the Sandinista government in Nicaragua during the 80s. Lots of interesting things were said, including this tense exchange. Do you think if you had heard that directly, you would have stayed at the rally? I think, Sydney, with all due respect, you don't understand a word that I'm saying. So what led Bernie to deliver such a forthright statement? Before we look at the rest of the interview, we need some context. Specifically, we need to examine American foreign policy in the 80s, during the Reagan years. Reagan had quite the reputation for supporting brutal, authoritarian regimes, including that of Nicaragua. Up until 1979, the U.S. supported Nicaraguan leader Somoza, providing him with lavish economic aid each year. However, Somoza was a brutal, corrupt dictator. With regards to education, he once declared, "I don't want an educated population, I want oxen." In 1978, the Organization of American States released a report condemning Somoza's regime for indiscriminate bombing of civilian populations, National Guard mop-up operations, and abuse and murder of peasant groups. So incidentally, the idea floating around recently that Trump is somehow unique in cozying up to dictators and strongmen is false. This has always been a part of the American tradition. Well, Somoza's repression eventually fomented revolution. In 1979, the Sandinistas overthrew Somoza and assumed power. 5 years later, they decisively won democratic elections that were certified by numerous international observers. However, throughout the 80s, right-wing rebel groups called the Contras began armed resistance against the Sandinista government. The Contras often employed terrorist tactics, deliberately attacking civilian targets. The United States encouraged and even participated in such actions. The CIA assisted the Contras in conducting airstrikes on airports and placed mines on fuel tankers in Nicaraguan harbors. A 1989 report by the Human Rights Watch condemned the Contras for launching indiscriminate attacks on civilians, selectively murdering non-combatants, and mistreating prisoners. However, Ronald Reagan, our great secular saint, called the Contras our brothers and the moral equivalents of the founding fathers. In fact, even after Congress banned U.S. aid to the Contras, the Reagan administration illegally sold arms to Iran to covertly fund the Contras. That's the infamous Iran-Contra affair. The effect of the civil war on Nicaragua was devastating. The death toll in per capita terms was significantly higher than the number of U.S. people killed in the Civil War and all the wars of the 20th century combined. It's pretty unambiguous that the United States was responsible for massive death and devastation in Nicaragua, all to try to overthrow a democratically ratified leftist government it didn't like. And Bernie Sanders, unlike basically every other politician in America, is aware of this bloody history. That's why he was angry with the New York Times reporter's jingoistic framing of American foreign policy towards Nicaragua. Let's take a look at the interview again. Let me just say this. I plead guilty to, throughout my adult life, doing everything that I can to prevent war and destruction. In the top of our story, we talk about the rally you attended in Managua, and a Wire report at the time said that there were anti-American chants from the crowd. The United States at that time, I don't know how much you know about this, was actively supporting the Contras to overthrow the government. So that there's anti-American sentiment, I remember that. I remember that event very clearly. You do recall hearing those chants. I think the Wire report has them saying, "Here, there, everywhere, the Yankee will die." They were fighting against American. Yes, what is your point? I wanted to. Are you shocked to learn that there was anti-American sentiment? My point was, I wanted to know if you had heard that. I don't remember, no. Of course, there was anti-American sentiment there. This was a war being funded by the United States against the people of Nicaragua. People were being killed in that war. Do you think if you had heard that directly, you would have stayed at the rally? I think, Sydney, with all due respect, you don't understand a word that I'm saying. The reporter tries to portray Bernie as some misguided extremist by basically saying, hey, the burden lies on you to justify why you were at rallies in Nicaragua where there were anti-American chants. But she conveys total ignorance about the massive amount of bloodshed the US is responsible for. All the reporter can focus on is us pitiable Americans being called bad names by people we are basically butchering. Bernie repeatedly reminds her that the US is funding a war against the Nicaraguan people, but she totally ignores this crucial point. For the record, the President Ortega government is no shining beacon of democracy, but that's not what's important when examining US policy towards Nicaragua in the 80s. The key points are that despite our professed love for democracy, we didn't care that the Sandinistas had won certified democratic elections at the time. Instead, we demanded a particular type of government and were willing to commit any amount of bloodshed in Nicaragua to make it happen. Simply recall our generous support for the murderous, absolutely anti-democratic regime of the dictator Somoza. Anyways, this line of questioning by the New York Times reporter shows you just how subservient the media is to the interests of American empire. There is no examination of our culpability for the human rights abuses during the Nicaraguan Civil War. The questions a good, independent journalist should be asking on this issue are, why did the US have no problem providing millions in aid to the dictator Somoza? Or, why did the US dismiss a world court ruling condemning US actions in Nicaragua? Instead, the media all too often obediently toes the line and unquestioningly supports the US government's endless foreign interventions.